The moment Captain Ryan Whitaker laughed at the old man's rank, every uniform in Heritage Hall was still sitting down, and none of them understood they were about to rise for a ghost from their own history. The hall sat on the east side of Ellsworth Air Force Base, where the South Dakota wind dragged dry leaves across the concrete and snapped the American flag hard enough to sound like a whip in the cold morning air. Inside, the lights were bright and clean, reflecting off glass cases filled with flight helmets, folded flags, squadron patches, and photographs of men who looked young forever because history had frozen them that way. The ceremony was supposed to begin in 20 minutes. Rows of blue chairs faced a small stage, and young airmen moved with clipped purpose, checking programs, straightening ribbons, adjusting microphones, pretending not to look nervous under the eyes of senior officers. Then the old man walked in. Walter Hayes was 74, white-haired, narrow-shouldered, and dressed in a faded gray coat that looked too plain for a room built around honor. His brown leather shoes had been polished, but the creases in them were deep, and he moved with the careful pace of a man whose bones remembered weather better than calendars did. He did not carry a cane. He did not wear medals. Near his collar was a small silver patch, dull with age, almost hidden against the fabric. Nobody saluted him. Nobody announced him. A civilian volunteer at the entrance glanced at the guest list, hesitated, then let him pass when he quietly said his name. Walter stepped into Heritage Hall and stopped beneath a black-and-white photograph of an old aircrew standing beside a transport aircraft, their faces half-shadowed by the sun. For several seconds, he looked at that picture the way some men look at a church door before entering a funeral. Across the room, Captain Ryan Whitaker noticed him. Ryan was 32, sharp-jawed, clean-cut, and wearing his service dress like it had been tailored around his pride. He had been placed in charge of ceremony flow, which meant seating mattered, timing mattered, and appearances mattered most of all. To Ryan, the old man looked misplaced, like someone's grandfather had wandered too close to the front row. Walter had moved toward the reserved section without touching a chair, only standing beside it, his eyes still on the photograph. Ryan crossed the room with two young lieutenants behind him, their shoes clicking in perfect rhythm. He stopped a few feet from Walter and smiled the kind of smile that was meant to be seen by everyone except the man receiving it. "Old-timer," Ryan said, loud enough for nearby airmen to hear. "Before you settle up front, what was your rank?" A small laugh slipped from one of the lieutenants. Another airman looked down at his program. Walter turned slowly. His eyes were pale blue, steady, and far too calm for the insult that had just landed between them. He studied Ryan's face, not with anger, not with fear, but with a tired patience that made the younger officer's smile tighten. The air vents hummed above them. Somewhere outside, the flag rope struck the pole with a hollow metallic tap. Walter's right hand rose and rested briefly near the old silver patch at his collar. When he spoke, his voice was low, roughened by age, and clear enough to carry. High enough to know when silence is better. The words did not sound like a comeback. They sounded like a door closing. Ryan blinked once, and the faint amusement around him thinned. But pride is a stubborn thing, especially when it wears polished buttons. He gave a short laugh, glanced at the lieutenants, and stepped slightly closer. "That's so," he said, "because this section is reserved for officers of distinction." Walter looked past him to the front row, then back to the photograph on the wall. For a moment, something moved across his face, not pain exactly, but memory under restraint. He nodded once, polite as a man yielding space on a sidewalk. "Then I won't be in your way, Captain." He turned and began walking toward the back of the hall. No protest, no explanation, no demand to be respected, just the soft scrape of old leather soles against the polished floor. Ryan watched him go, pleased with himself, unaware that near the registration table, Emily Carter had stopped sorting programs. She was a civilian. Records coordinator, 39, quiet, observant, the kind of woman who noticed when a name carried weight before anyone else felt it. She had seen Walter's hand touch that silver patch. She had seen the way he looked at the photograph. Now her eyes moved from the old man to the framed crew on the wall, and something in her expression changed. The ceremony had not started yet, but the first mistake had already been made. Walter chose the last row without complaint. He sat near the aisle, beneath a framed shadow box holding a folded flag and a brass plate so polished that it reflected the lights above him in thin gold streaks. From there, the stage looked smaller, the officers looked younger, and the photograph on the far wall looked farther away than it had a minute before. He folded his hands over his knees and kept his eyes forward. The silver patch near his collar caught one narrow beam of light, then went dull again. Captain Ryan Whitaker returned to the front with the satisfied stride of a man who believed order had been restored. The two lieutenants stayed close to him, one smirking, the other trying not to. Around them, the hall continued preparing itself for ceremony. Programs whispered open. Ribbons were checked. A microphone gave a brief soft crackle, then settled. Outside, the prairie wind pressed against the doors and slipped through the seams with a low, steady breath. Emily Carter stood behind the registration table with Walter's name still in her mind. She had worked around military records long enough to know the difference between nostalgia and recognition. The way Walter had looked at that photograph was not casual. It was not the look of a guest admiring old service members. It was the look of a man counting faces and hearing voices no one else could hear. She glanced down at the printed guest list. Walter Hayes appeared near the bottom, typed plainly, with no title before his name and no unit listed beside it. That should have made him ordinary. Instead, it made her uneasy. She opened the digital roster on her laptop and searched again. The same name appeared, but this time a small gray icon sat beside it, one she had almost missed. Restricted Archive Reference. Emily felt her fingers pause above the keyboard. Across the hall, Ryan had noticed Walter looking back toward the photograph again. The old man was not causing trouble, but something about his silence irritated him. Ryan liked clear categories: active duty, retired officer, family member, civilian guest. Walter did not fit neatly into any of them, and that made Ryan feel as if the room had a loose thread he needed to pull. He walked halfway down the aisle, not all the way, just far enough to be heard. "Sir," Ryan said, still smiling, "just so we keep things accurate for the program, were you enlisted, officer, or just here with a family member?" A few heads turned. Walter lifted his eyes. He did not answer right away. The pause lasted long enough for the air conditioning to become noticeable, humming softly through the ceiling vents. Then he said, "I was here with men who did not make it into many programs." The words landed quietly, but Emily heard them. So did Master Sergeant Daniel Price, a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s who had been checking the seating chart near the sidewall. Price looked over, not at Ryan, but at Walter's collar. For 1 second, his expression changed. Not recognition. Not yet. Something closer to alarm. Ryan gave a small laugh, sharper than before. "That is poetic," he said. "But this event has assigned seating for a reason." Walter nodded once, as if Ryan had explained something simple and unimportant. "Then follow your seating chart, Captain." There was no insult in his voice, which somehow made Ryan look smaller. He turned back toward the front, his jaw tight. Emily watched him go, then looked again at her laptop. She clicked the restricted icon. A warning box appeared, asking for administrative credentials. She entered hers. The system hesitated. Then another message appeared. "Access limited. Contact Base Historical Office." Emily's uneasiness became something colder. She picked up the desk phone and dialed the extension printed on the internal directory. While it rang, she looked toward Walter again. He was sitting still, but his gaze had returned to the black and white photograph. The crew in. That picture stood beside an aircraft under a hard white sun, their uniforms faded by time, their names listed on a small plaque beneath the frame. Emily narrowed her eyes and read the final name on the second line. Lieutenant Colonel W. Hayes. Her hand tightened around the phone. At the front of the hall, Ryan adjusted the microphone and prepared to begin a ceremony about honor, unaware that the man he had sent to the back row had once stood inside the very history hanging above them. A young second lieutenant named Mark Ellison approached the last row with a courtesy smile and a stack of small coat tags in his hand. He had been sent to clear the aisle before the ceremony began, because Captain Whitaker wanted the hall to look sharp when the senior officers entered. Walter saw him coming and already knew what the young man intended to do. Lieutenant Ellison stopped beside him and lowered his voice. "Sir, we are collecting outerwear for guests, so the rows stay clean. I can hang that up for you." Walter looked at the code across his shoulders, then at the neat brass rack near the entrance. For the first time since he had entered Heritage Hall, his face tightened. Not much. Just enough. I will keep it, he said. The lieutenant hesitated, glancing toward the front, where Ryan was watching from beside the podium. Ryan gave a small, impatient motion with 2 fingers. The message was clear. Handle it. Ellison shifted his weight, embarrassed to be pressing an old man over a coat, but too junior to ignore a captain's order. I understand, sir, but it is part of the setup. I will put your name on it and bring it back after the event. Walter's right hand moved to the collar, covering the small silver patch. His fingers were thin, but steady. Not this one. The softness of his answer should have ended the matter. It did not. Ryan stepped off the stage and walked down the aisle, his polished shoes striking the floor with measured authority. The low conversations around the hall began to fade. He stopped beside Ellison and looked at Walter as if patience were a favor he had already given away. Mr. Hayes, this is a formal United States Air Force ceremony, Ryan said. We are trying to maintain a certain standard. Walter looked up at him from the chair. Standards matter. Ryan smiled. Then you understand. Walter did not move. Ryan's eyes dropped to the patch near Walter's collar. It was not bright enough to impress anyone. It was a worn piece of silver-threaded fabric, shaped like a narrow winged emblem, with letters so faded they seemed more like scratches than text. To Ryan, it looked like something bought at a surplus store 30 years ago and kept out of sentiment. He reached out, not to grab it, but to indicate it with 2 careless fingers. Before he touched the fabric, Walter's hand came up and closed gently around Ryan's wrist. The movement was quiet, controlled, and so precise that the young captain stopped breathing for half a second. Walter did not squeeze. He did not threaten. He simply stopped him. Careful with that one, Walter said. The hall became still. Ryan looked down at the old man's hand, then back at his face. Heat rose along his neck, because the room had seen him halted by someone he had already decided was harmless. It is just an old patch, Ryan said, pulling his hand free with a short laugh. No need to be dramatic. Near the side wall, Master Sergeant Daniel Price had gone completely still. He had heard the words. He had seen the patch. Now he took one slow step closer, eyes narrowed, his expression losing all casual warmth. Price had served long enough to know that some symbols did not appear in modern training manuals and were not worn by men who wanted attention. He looked from the patch to Walter's face, then toward the black and white photograph above the front display case. The resemblance was faint, buried under 50 years of weather and age, but it was there. The same set of the jaw, the same eyes, light and level beneath a hard sun. Emily Carter saw Price staring and felt the uneasiness in her chest tighten. The phone at her ear finally clicked, and a woman from the base historical office answered with a tired professional voice. Emily turned slightly away from the room and spoke low. This is Emily Carter at Heritage Hall. I need confirmation on a restricted archive reference. Connected to a guest named Walter Hayes. There was a pause on the line. Keyboard taps. Then silence. Can you repeat the name? The woman asked. Emily repeated it. This time the pause lasted longer. Across the hall, Ryan had folded his arms and was speaking down at Walter again, quieter now, but more cutting. Sir, no one is questioning your service. But this is not the place for mysterious little keepsakes. Walter's eyes moved past Ryan toward the photograph, and for one brief second, the hall seemed to fall away from him. The glass cases, the chairs, the young uniforms, the polished floor, all of it thinned into a memory of sun glare on aluminum, wind over open ground, and a radio voice calling his name through static. He blinked once, and he was back in the last row. Some keepsakes are heavier than they look, he said. Ryan shook his head, impatient. Then maybe you should have worn something people could recognize. Master Sergeant Price turned without a word and walked quickly toward the side exit, already reaching for his phone. Emily heard the woman on the line inhale softly. Miss Carter, the historical office said, her voice suddenly careful. Do not remove that guest from the building. Emily looked at Walter Hayes sitting alone in the last row, one hand resting over the old silver patch, while Captain Whitaker stood over him with all the confidence of a man who had mistaken silence for weakness. The ceremony began with the kind of order Captain Ryan Whitaker trusted. The first note of the national anthem rose through Heritage Hall, and every conversation ended at once. Chairs stopped scraping. Programs lowered. Hands came to hearts where appropriate, Uniforms faced the flag, and the hall became a clean line of still bodies under bright, white lights. Walter Hayes stood in the last row like everyone else, his faded gray coat hanging from his narrow shoulders, his right hand resting over his heart and over the old silver patch beneath it. His face gave away nothing. When the anthem ended, the room settled back into its seats, and Ryan took the podium with his chin high and his speech folder squared perfectly against the wood. He welcomed families, officers, airmen, civilian staff, and honored guests. His voice was confident, polished, and practiced. He spoke about legacy, discipline, and the sacred chain connecting past and present. At the back of the hall, Walter listened without moving. The words rolled over him like wind across dry grass. Some were true, some were too clean. Emily Carter remained at the registration table with the phone pressed to her ear, her eyes moving between Walter and her laptop screen. The woman from the historical office had placed her on hold, but not before saying enough to make Emily afraid of making a sound. On the screen, a file reference had appeared, then vanished behind a red restricted notice. Only one fragment remained visible before the system locked again: Operation High Lantern. Emily had never heard the name. Master Sergeant Daniel Price had disappeared through the side exit, and his absence made the room feel uneven, as if a weight had shifted where no one else could see it. Ryan continued speaking, unaware of the calls moving quietly beyond the walls. "Today," he said, "we honor the men of the High Lantern aircrew, whose courage helped shape the standards we still live by." At the sound of those words, Walter's eyelids lowered. Not closed fully, just enough that the hall blurred at the edges. The bright lights above him thinned into a red glow. The polished floor became vibrating metal beneath his boots. The hum of the air vents stretched into the deep engine drone of an aircraft pushing through weather over open country. He heard radio static. He smelled hot wiring, fuel, sweat inside canvas straps, and the sharp cold of high-altitude air slipping through seams it was never meant to find. A younger voice called, "Hayes, you still with us?" Walter saw hands moving over instruments, faces lit by red cabin light, a silver patch on a sleeve, a photograph tucked near a console. Then the memory folded back into silence before it could become anything more. He opened his eyes. Heritage Hall returned. No one had noticed except Emily, who saw the old man's fingers press once against the patch as if holding a door shut. Ryan turned a page. Many names from that era were preserved, he said, though some details remain incomplete. He gave a small ceremonial smile, the kind meant to make uncertainty sound noble. But what matters is that true officers understood duty without needing applause. The words struck the back of the hall harder than Ryan knew. Walter's gaze moved to the black and white photograph above the display case. He was in it, younger by half a century, standing partly behind another officer, sunlight cutting across his face. The plaque beneath the frame listed him as Lieutenant Colonel W. Hayes, because that was what the public record had been allowed to keep. It did not say what he had carried. It did not say whose letters he mailed after the ceremony. It did not say why he never wore that patch in crowded rooms. Emily's call clicked back. A new voice came on, male, older, sharper. "This is Major Collins with the Historical Office. Who authorized Walter Hayes to attend today?" Emily swallowed. "He is on the guest list, sir." "Where is he now?" "In the hall. Last row." The major went quiet. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. "Listen carefully. Do not let Captain Whitaker remove him. Do not let anyone take his coat. I am escalating this to the wing commander." Emily looked toward Ryan at the podium, then to Walter in the last row. The ceremony kept moving, smooth and polished, while beneath it, something buried for decades had begun to rise. Ryan should have let the ceremony carry him forward, but pride kept pulling his eyes toward the last row. Walter Hayes sat too quietly, too comfortably, as if being moved away from honor had not touched him at all. That bothered Ryan more than an argument would have. A man who argued could be controlled. A man who stayed silent made the room feel uncertain. Ryan finished the prepared section of his remarks, accepted the polite applause, and placed both hands on the sides of the podium. His speech folder sat open in front of him, but he stopped reading. Instead, he looked out across the rows of uniforms and guests with a smile that seemed harmless from a distance. "Before we continue," he said, "I want to remind everyone why protocol exists. The United States Air Force is built on structure. Rank is not decoration. It is earned. It tells us who carried responsibility, who led, and who simply remembers serving. The words were polished, but Emily Carter heard the edge under them. Her hand tightened around the receiver. Major Collins was still on the line, waiting while another call transferred upward. "Captain Whitaker is speaking about rank now," she whispered. "In what way?" the major asked. Emily did not answer right away, because Ryan had turned his gaze fully toward the back of the hall. "Sometimes," Ryan continued, "people attend events like this with old stories, old patches, and old claims. We respect all service, of course. But today we are honoring real officers whose records are clear." The room changed. Not loudly, not visibly at first, but the temperature of the silence shifted. A few airmen looked down. One retired spouse in the second row frowned. Lieutenant Mark Ellison stared at the floor, suddenly ashamed of the coat tag still in his hand. Walter did not move. He sat beneath the shadow box, hands folded, eyes resting on Ryan as if listening to a distant weather report. The old silver patch lay half hidden against his collar, dull and patient. Ryan seemed encouraged by the lack of resistance. He gave another small laugh. "So if any gentleman here feels his rank deserves front row treatment, I hope he brought something more official than a mysterious keepsake." Emily's voice dropped to a breath. "Major, he just said that in front of the room." On the other end, Major Collins went silent. Then he said, "Put me on speaker near no one. Keep this line open." At the side door, Master Sergeant Daniel Price returned. His face no longer held uncertainty. He moved with controlled urgency, one hand still holding his phone, the other flat against his dress jacket, as if keeping himself from speaking too soon. He did not go to Ryan. He went straight to Emily. She covered the receiver and looked at him. Price leaned close and spoke so low that only she could hear. "That patch is from the High Lantern Recovery Detachment. There were fewer than a dozen made." Emily felt the air leave her chest. "Are you sure?" Price looked toward Walter. "My first supervisor had a photograph of one in his office. He said if you ever saw it on a living man, you were standing near history that had not been fully written down." At the podium, Ryan was preparing to move on, satisfied that his point had landed. But before he could turn the page, Walter rose from the last row. The movement was slow, not weak, and the hall followed it without meaning to. Chair fabric whispered. Heads turned. Walter did not walk toward the stage. He simply stood beside his seat, reached to his collar, and carefully unpinned the old silver patch. For a moment it rested in his palm, small enough to disappear, heavy enough to quiet the room. He looked at it for one long second, and the lights above caught the worn threads like frost on metal. Then he stepped to the aisle and placed it gently on the nearest empty chair, as if setting down something that belonged to men not present. "You are right, Captain," Walter said, his voice calm. "Some things should not be claimed without proof." Ryan's smile flickered. The words should have sounded like surrender. They did not. Master Sergeant Price stared at the patch on the chair, and his face went pale with recognition. Emily heard Major Collins return on the phone, but now another voice was behind him, deeper and more authoritative. "This is Colonel Mercer," the voice said. "Confirm the guest is Walter Hayes, white male, approximately 74, gray coat, silver High Lantern patch." Emily looked across the hall at the old man, standing alone in the aisle. "Confirmed, sir." Colonel Mercer exhaled, not in doubt, but in disbelief. "Nobody touches that patch. Nobody removes that man. I am contacting General Aldrich now." Ryan gripped the podium, finally sensing that the room had slipped beyond his control. Walter Hayes stood in the aisle, empty-handed and unshaken, while the small silver patch on the chair began to look less like a keepsake and more like a warning the captain had been too proud to read. Master Sergeant Daniel Price did not wait for permission from the podium. He walked down the side aisle with the slow control of a man holding back more emotion than he wanted anyone to see. Every step of his dress shoes sounded clear against the polished floor. Ryan watched him from the stage, his expression tightening, but he said nothing at first because senior non-commissioned officers had a way of making even young captains measure their tone. Price stopped beside the empty chair where Walter had placed the old silver patch. He did not touch it. He only looked down. The silver threads were worn nearly flat, the edges softened by years of handling. But the shape was unmistakable to him now. A winged lantern. A narrow bar beneath it. 3 faded letters that had survived time by refusing to disappear. Price swallowed once, then turned toward Walter, who still stood in the aisle with his hands relaxed at his sides. The room waited. The microphone at the podium gave a faint electric hum. Outside, the wind pushed against the hall doors and made the hinges murmur. Price came to attention. Not halfway, not casually, fully. His heels aligned, his shoulders squared, his chin lifted. Then, in front of officers, guests, families, and the captain who had mocked the old man, Master Sergeant Daniel Price raised his right hand and saluted Walter Hayes. No one breathed for a moment. Walter's face changed only in the smallest way. His eyes lowered, not in embarrassment, but in grief held with discipline. "Master Sergeant," he said quietly, "you do not have to do that." Price kept his hand up. "Yes, sir," he answered. "I believe I do." The words carried farther than either man intended. A young airman in the 3rd row turned to the person beside him with confusion on his face. Lieutenant Mark Ellison stared at the coat tag in his hand as if it had become something shameful. Emily Carter remained near the registration table, the phone pressed to her ear, listening to Colonel Mercer speak quickly to someone higher. "General Aldridge has been notified," the colonel said. "He is on base. He is coming to Heritage Hall now." Emily's eyes moved to Ryan. The captain had stepped away from the podium, his mouth set in a thin line. "Master Sergeant Price," Ryan said, forcing calm into his voice, "you are interrupting the ceremony." Price did not lower his salute. "Captain, with respect, the ceremony was already interrupted." Ryan's face flushed. "By what?" Price's eyes stayed on Walter. "By a mistake." That word moved through the hall more sharply than a shout. Ryan looked at the patch, then at Walter, then at the room watching him. He tried to reclaim the floor with rank, because rank was the tool he trusted most. "Everyone remain seated," he said. "We are not turning this into some display." But the command did not settle the room. It exposed the change inside it. One retired officer in the 2nd row leaned forward, studying Walter's face. A civilian guest covered her mouth. A lieutenant colonel near the center aisle looked toward the old photograph on the wall, then back to the man standing beneath the shadow box. Recognition was not complete yet, but doubt had entered the hall, and doubt is where pride begins to lose ground. Walter finally stepped toward Price, slowly, and returned the salute with quiet precision. His hand rose cleanly despite his age, held for one measured second, then lowered. Price lowered his own hand afterward, but he remained standing. The 2 men looked at each other as if something had passed between them that the room had not earned the right to hear. Ryan moved closer, voice lower now. "Mr. Hayes, I need you to sit down." Walter looked at him. "No, Captain. You need to listen." Emily heard Colonel Mercer's voice change again on the phone, suddenly clipped and formal. Someone else had joined the line. A deeper voice asked, "Is the patch visible?" Emily answered before she realized she was speaking. "Yes, sir." "Is Master Sergeant Price standing?" "Yes, sir." The deep voice went silent for half a second. Then it said, "Tell them no one continues that ceremony until I arrive." Emily turned toward the stage, but she did not need to speak. The room already felt paused by an order none of them had heard. Price stood beside Walter. The silver patch rested on the empty chair between past and present. And for the first time that morning, Captain Ryan Whitaker looked out over Heritage Hall and understood that every person in it was no longer waiting for him. The order to pause the ceremony traveled through Heritage Hall without ever needing to be repeated over the microphone. Emily Carter lowered the phone from her ear, but her eyes stayed fixed on the side entrance, where Master Sergeant Daniel Price had returned only minutes earlier. Captain Ryan Whitaker stood near the podium, no longer speaking, one hand resting on the edge of the wood, as if it were the last solid thing he trusted. Walter Hayes remained in the aisle beside the last row, the old silver patch still lying on the empty chair like a small piece of weathered moonlight. Nobody touched it. Nobody dared. The bright overhead lights made every uniform look sharper and every silence feel heavier. A young airman shifted in his seat and stopped the instant his chair made a sound. Ryan looked toward Emily, then toward Price, trying to understand how a ceremony he had controlled with seating charts and printed remarks had slipped into the hands of people who were not even on his schedule. "Who is coming?" Ryan asked, keeping his voice low. Emily did not answer him at first. She was listening to the line again. Colonel Mercer had placed her on hold, but not before saying General Thomas Aldridge was moving from headquarters to Heritage Hall. The name carried weight across the base. Even the air around it seemed formal. When Emily finally looked at Ryan, there was no satisfaction in her face. Only warning. "General Aldridge," she said. Ryan's expression changed so quickly that several people saw it. The confidence did not vanish all at once. It cracked first. "For this?" he asked. Price turned his head slightly. "Yes, Captain. For this." Outside the hall, beyond the closed doors, a vehicle rolled to a stop near the curb. The sound was muted by the walls, but Walter heard it. He had spent too many years learning which sounds mattered. His eyes moved toward the entrance, and for a brief moment, the present loosened its grip again. He saw another doorway long ago, not in South Dakota, not under clean lights, but under a red lamp swinging gently as engines trembled through metal ribs. He remembered a young officer with Aldridge on his name tape, barely old enough to hide his fear, holding a folded photograph of his wife and infant son. Walter remembered the man asking him, in a voice steadier than his hands, to make sure the picture got home if he could not. Then the memory softened before it could turn sharp. Walter blinked, and Heritage Hall returned with its glass cases, its folded flags, and its rows of people waiting for a truth they could feel before they knew it. Emily's phone clicked again. This time the voice was deeper, closer, and calm in the way only real authority can afford to be calm. "Miss Carter, this is General Aldridge. I am at the hall doors. Is Colonel Hayes still inside?" Emily looked at Walter. The name struck her so hard, she almost forgot to breathe. "Colonel Hayes. Not Mr. Hayes. Not guest. Not old-timer." "Yes, sir," she said softly. "He is here." Ryan heard the title from where he stood. His face went still. Lieutenant Mark Ellison heard it too, and his eyes lifted from the coat tag in his hand to the old man in the aisle. Master Sergeant Price closed his eyes for half a second, as if a missing piece had finally locked into place. The doors opened before anyone could speak. Cold air entered first, carrying the dry smell of wind and pavement. Then General Thomas Aldridge stepped into Heritage Hall in full-service dress, tall, white-haired at the temples, his face composed but not distant. Two officers followed behind him, then stopped just inside the entrance when they saw the room. General Aldridge did not look at the podium. He did not ask who had interrupted the ceremony. He did not glance at Ryan for permission, because permission belonged to someone else now. He walked straight down the center aisle, past rows of seated airmen and officers, past the framed photographs, past the display cases that suddenly seemed too small to hold what they represented. His shoes struck the floor with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Walter watched him approach without moving. The two men met near the last row, beside the empty chair and the silver patch. For a moment, the general said nothing. His eyes lowered to the patch, then rose to Walter's face. Whatever he saw there belonged to family history, military history, and debts too old for speeches. General Aldridge came to attention. His shoulders squared, his chin lifted. In the stunned quiet of Heritage Hall, he raised his right hand and saluted Walter Hayes. General Aldridge held the salute, and the whole hall seemed to lean into that single silent motion. Walter Hayes did not return it right away. For one breath, he only looked at the general with those pale blue eyes, steady and tired, as if measuring not the man in front of him, but the years standing between them. Then Walter lifted his hand. His salute was slower now than it might have been decades ago, but it was clean, exact, and shaped by a discipline that time had not been able to bend. When his hand lowered, General Aldridge lowered his as well, and still no one spoke. The first chair moved near the side aisle. It was Master Sergeant Daniel Price. He had already been standing, but now he straightened fully, heels together, eyes forward, giving the moment the weight it deserved. A lieutenant colonel in the third row rose next. Not quickly, not because someone ordered him. He stood because the general had shown him what the room had failed to see. Then a major stood. Then two captains. Then a row of young airmen who did not yet understand the entire story, but understood enough to know respect when it entered the room. The sound was soft at first, fabric shifting, chair legs whispering against polished floor, programs folding against palms. Then it spread. Row by row, Heritage Hall rose for Walter Hayes. No applause came. Applause would have felt too loud, too easy, too small. This was quieter and heavier. This was the sound of people correcting themselves. Captain Ryan Whitaker remained near the podium, frozen behind the microphone he no longer controlled. He watched officers senior to him stand. He watched enlisted airmen stand. He watched civilian guests stand with their hands clasped in front of them, faces solemn, eyes fixed on the old man in the gray coat. Ryan's fingers loosened from the podium edge. His mouth opened once, but nothing came out. The last thing he had called a mysterious keepsake lay on the chair between Walter and the general, catching the overhead light in dull silver. General Aldridge turned slightly, not to address the room in ceremony voice, but to speak as a man paying a debt. Colonel Walter Hayes served with the High Lantern Detachment when most of its record was sealed, he said. His name was shortened in public files. His actions were not. Walter's jaw tightened, not with pride, but with the discomfort of a man hearing private weight spoken aloud. Aldridge continued carefully. My father was a young officer on that crew. He came home because Colonel Hayes refused to leave him behind in the dark. My family had a father, and I had a name to carry, because this man did his duty when no one was watching. The room stayed standing. Emily Carter felt her eyes sting, but she did not look away. Lieutenant Mark Ellison slowly closed his hand around the unused coat tag and lowered it to his side, ashamed of how small the morning had been before this moment. Ryan finally stepped down from the stage. He did not walk toward Walter yet. He only stood beside the first row, as if the distance from the podium to the aisle had become longer than any runway on the base. General Aldridge looked at him then, and the look was not cruel. That made it worse. Captain Whitaker, he said, you asked about his rank as if rank was a punchline. Remember this. The worth of a uniform is not proven by how sharply it is worn. It is proven by how deeply it teaches humility. Ryan lowered his eyes. Around him, every person remained standing, and the silence did what no reprimand could have done. It showed him the size of the man he had tried to reduce. Walter bent slowly and picked up the silver patch from the empty chair. He held it in his palm for a moment, then pinned it back near his collar with careful fingers. When he looked up, the hall was still standing for him. He gave them no speech. He offered no victory. He only nodded once, small and solemn, and in that nod was the entire history of men who had carried more than they ever claimed. Walter Hayes stood beneath the bright lights of Heritage Hall while the room remained on its feet, and for the first time that morning, Captain Ryan Whitaker looked like a man who understood the difference between being obeyed and being respected. General Aldridge stepped beside Walter, not in front of him, and that small choice said more than the speech ever could. Colonel Hayes did not come here to be honored, the general said. He came because the names on that wall still mattered to him. Walter looked toward the black and white photograph again. The young faces in it stayed unchanged behind the glass, untouched by age, untouched by ceremony, still standing in a sunlit moment the rest of the world had nearly forgotten. The record was limited for many years, General Aldridge continued. Some details remained sealed, and some stories belonged to families, not microphones. But this much can be said. The High Lantern crew brought men home who were not expected to return. Colonel Hayes carried responsibility when the room was dark, the radio was failing, and nobody was watching except those who needed him. No one moved. Even the air vents seemed quieter. Ryan came down the aisle slowly, stopping several feet from Walter. His shoulders were no longer squared with arrogance. His hands were empty. The shine of his buttons, the sharp crease of his uniform, the captain's bars on his shoulders, all of it looked different now, not smaller, but unfinished. He swallowed once. Colonel Hayes, he said, and the title sounded heavy in his mouth. I owe you an apology. Walter studied him with the same calm eyes that had endured the insult, the laughter, the careless reach toward the patch. Yes, Walter said. Ryan's face tightened, because the answer was honest enough to hurt. I was wrong, Ryan said. I treated your silence like it meant you had nothing behind it. I treated your age like it made your service less real. I am sorry, sir. The hall held the apology without rescuing him from it. Walter let the silence remain for a moment, not to punish him, but to make sure the lesson had room to settle. Then he stepped closer and looked at the young captain's uniform. You wear that well, Walter said. Ryan blinked, surprised by the mercy in it. Walter's gaze lifted to his face. Now learn to carry it well. Ryan nodded, once, deeply. Yes, sir. Walter reached up and touched the silver patch near his collar, not removing it this time. only feeling its worn edge beneath his fingertips. "Rank can open doors," he said. "It cannot tell you who is standing in front of you." The words moved through Heritage Hall with the quiet force of a flag being folded. General Aldridge lowered his eyes. Master Sergeant Price stood straighter. Emily Carter looked down at the guest list on her table, where Walter Hayes had been printed without title, without unit, without explanation, and she understood how easily history could be made invisible when people stopped looking closely. The ceremony did continue, but not as planned. Ryan did not return to the podium first. General Aldridge did. He asked Walter to sit in the front row, not as a guest of convenience, but as the honored officer he had always been. Walter hesitated. Then he walked down the aisle while every person remained standing. The distance from the last row to the first could not have been more than 50 feet, yet it felt like the hall was giving him back decades one quiet step at a time. When Walter reached the front, Ryan personally pulled out the chair. He did it without performance, without a smile meant for witnesses. Walter sat, and only then did the room sit with him. The rest of the ceremony was simpler, slower, and truer. Fewer polished phrases. More silence where silence belonged. At the end, Walter rose before anyone could surround him with praise. He nodded to General Aldridge, to Master Sergeant Price, to Emily, and finally to Ryan. Then he walked toward the doors alone, his gray coat moving softly around him. Outside, the South Dakota wind met him with its cold, clean breath. Behind him, through the glass, every uniform in Heritage Hall remained still for one final second before life resumed. Walter stepped into the morning light, carrying no trophy, asking for no apology beyond the one already given, leaving only the weight of a lesson no one in that room would forget. Respect is not demanded. It is earned, carried, and remembered.